CompTIA Cloud Plus, detailed scaling approaches. Before we dive in, let's just define scaling, because we're talking about scaling out and scaling in, for example, instances and containers. So detailed scaling, according to CompTIA, refers to the granular application of different scaling techniques to ensure performance, availability, and cost efficiency. In this lesson, we're going to look at 3 types to be aware of on the exam. First, we have triggered scaling. Triggered scaling is also known as dynamic scaling. Here's where you automatically adjust capacity in response to real-time metrics. It uses services like AWS CloudWatch alarms to monitor metrics like CPU utilization, request count, or custom metrics. Here's how it works. You define scaling policies that specify thresholds. We'll see this later on. At AWS, we use what's called a launch template. When a metric crosses a threshold, for example, CPU greater than 70%, a service alarm triggers a scaling action. Auto-scaling then adds or removes instances to maintain performance. There's 3 types of triggered or dynamic scaling policies. First, we have target tracking. Here's where you keep a metric, for example, the average CPU, at a target value. And then step scaling. Here, we scale in steps based on how far the metric deviates from the threshold. And then simple scaling is basically triggering a single scaling action after a cool-down period. An excellent use case for triggered scaling is when you have applications with unpredictable or fluctuating workloads, such as front-end web servers, Apache or IIS, or API calls. Next, we have scheduled scaling. AWS also calls this predictive scaling. Scheduled scaling allows you to scale resources at specific times based on predictable usage patterns. Here's how it works. You create scheduled actions that define the desired capacity, optional minimum and maximum capacity, and the start time, end time, and recurrence pattern, for example, with a cron expression. At the scheduled time, the CSP adjusts the capacity accordingly. An example might be scaling out to 10 instances every weekday at 9 a.m. and scaling in to 2 instances at 6 p.m. The benefits of scheduled scaling are that it optimizes cost by provisioning resources only when you need them. And it works well with predictable traffic patterns, such as business hours or batch jobs. Here we see an auto-scaling group at Amazon Web Services. The tool that's used is the launch template, along with AWS CloudWatch, which is your monitoring and optimization tool for auto-scaling. As mentioned earlier, the key value is the desired capacity. So for example, we might say 10 Apache web servers. Then the minimum size, let's say 5, will never go below the threshold of 5 Apache servers, even if there's no traffic. And then of course, you can scale out as needed to a maximum size. And that's a very important value because this is not like Buzz Lightyear. You're not going to scale out to infinity and beyond, right? At some point, you're going to have a loss when it comes to the cost-benefit analysis or your return on investment ROI. So we might scale out from 10 to 20 and then maximum of 50 Apache web servers. And again, at AWS, they call it dynamic scaling or targeted scaling, and they call scheduled scaling predictive scaling. There's a third type, manual scaling. Manual scaling gives you direct control over the number of instances in an auto-scaling group. You manually set the desired capacity, for example, using the AWS console or the Google Cloud console, maybe a Cloud Shell at Azure or a PowerShell client, or use a command line interface or a software development kit. There's lots of ways to do it. AWS autoscaling launches or terminates instances to match the new desired count when you decide to manual scale. You can also terminate specific instances and optionally decrement the desired capacity as needed. The benefits of manual scaling are it's useful for one-time adjustments or when you're conducting tests. After manual scaling, Automatic policies, if enabled, can resume normal operation. And you may want to temporarily suspend scaling policies in order to avoid conflicts. I hope this lesson was valuable. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.